Okay, hello guys, today is 4th of September 2022. Okay, yep, the video is all set up. So, I'm gonna be talking today, right now. This video is gonna be about actual social situation in Ukraine, why so many Russians have supported the war and still support the war, and what can we expect in the near months. Right, obviously the action of sanctions, how they influence Russia and things like this. So I know it's kind of like coming from Ukrainian people will go, what the fuck, but to be honest, this is a subject not very much spoken about, and this is the subject which quite often has a coverage of people who have, well, next to no understanding of how life is in Russia, essentially. So I thought, like, I'm gonna cover it a bit from the person who is born in Ukraine but speaks fluent Russian as well as Ukrainian, English, and some really bad German. But obviously, trying to kind of let people know about how things are and be closer to what to expect. So, at the start of the video, you probably see another channel on here, which is a privateer station. I generally kind of use this opportunity to advertise channels like this because I'm not a very good YouTuber. I'm not very good at making those videos, and I shouldn't be doing this. Technically, I'm doing this in English literally because I want people to know, and if there's any other sources, then yes, I want to direct them to those sources. So one of the sources is a privateer station, and this is a guy who dubs videos which are made by one of the, well, more respected Ukrainian analytics, which is Alexey Arestovich. And again, I talked about him in the previous video, but this guy essentially he's an advisor to a presidential cabinet. Right, he's military trained. He's trained in intelligence. He worked in intelligence as an intelligence analyst, but he was also active military personnel during the war in 2014. So he had a few trips behind enemy lines while the first Russian attacks happened on Ukraine. So he's a very interesting person to listen to. The videos that are being translated, they usually like a couple of days late to what he actually says now. But it's a pretty good channel, again, to get at least some of the feedback about the way Ukrainians feel. Another channel which is disappeared, but this is a channel by a Ukrainian guy, Denis Davidov, and he lives in Kiev. I found him recently. He makes good short videos about stuff, and he kind of puts in enough irony and bit of sarcasm in his videos. But unlike stuff I do where I end up talking because I don't really script my videos, this guy actually scripts them very well. He reads the script properly, so he makes them short, fast, and entertaining for people with a short attention span or who simply don't want to really kind of delve into certain things but want to kind of a good, interesting overview from a point of view of the person who's actually Ukrainian, who's actually on the ground. You know, he's in Kiev, unlike me, who's looking at the things from a bit further away. And you should watch his channel, subscribe. I think he deserves it. He's got 302,000 subscribers. Probably should be getting to 1 million pretty soon because it's an interesting one. So, okay, let's talk about now. Obviously, this is my channel over there, which is probably one of the most boring channels on YouTube. I can be self-critical, but let's get to a serious kind of subject. And this is a video. This is actually from 2020. 20. And this is a video, I've actually used it in the video I've made in Ukrainian about the same subject. Was like, you know, looking at the Russians, because at some point of time people were saying like, look, 70 to 80% of Russians are supporting the invasion of Ukraine. And people were like, it can't be true, you know, I know these Russians and these Russians are cool, it can't be that bad. Well, to understand that, like, you know, I often see that, like, you know, rich Russians, very well-off Russians coming up with some BS. Well, like, to understand this, what it says on this video is 17,000 ruble a month. If your income is 17,000 rubles a month, you are a middle class. Now, at the time when this video was made, 17,000 rubles a month was something between $200 and $250 depending on exchange costs, because it's been kind of fluctuating a bit. So essentially you had like between $250 to $200 to survive for a month, including paying all your bills and things like this. So, and the reply is uйди нах, so it's essentially fuck off, right? As this is the guy which is called Separate Civilization. And this is a Russian channel, and this is the guy who's not from a central city. He's from like further away cities, some of the cities that most people in the Moscow don't even know exist. And this was like one of my conversations with the Russian guys here in Berlin. And I went up and he was like, look, I'm from this town, the name of which I forgot now. I think, I'm not gonna say it, but he was like, most of the people in Moscow who consider themselves to be like the advanced people, you know, like, they don't know my city even exists, and that's a city of nearly 1 million people. Okay, so that's kind of how it goes, that like most of the people try to judge something by the kind of top 30% of people in Moscow, right? But they generally don't look at things like this video over here. Oh, for me it's kind of here. Right, so that video down there, right? Basically they have very little information. The one that does come through, you know, people kind of go like, oh, it can't be that bad, but it's actually that bad. And I made a video in about 2019, at the beginning of the 2019, saying, look, you know, when things are gonna get really bad in Russia, right, that will be the last thing that the Putin regime is gonna do. They're gonna attack the Ukraine. And again, back then I've seen videos of people like saying that, look, you know, there is apparently a war in Ukraine, and yet if I get some information from, like, you know, internet, some YouTube video of somebody showing how they live in Ukraine, and they show the kind of food their children have in the kindergarten, and then the free meal they have in school, right? I can't even afford to send my kids to kindergarten. I can't afford to give my kids this food myself, and these motherfuckers are having that in the kindergarten, free meals in school, right? It's like, that was the kind of difference. And I was like, okay, you know, and this is not like something which is just a one-off person. The stories, many people who speak Russian might have heard, where they were still debating, you know, which part of the courtyard they should build toilets in the school. It was essentially like a hole in the floor type of toilets built for schools in certain towns in Russia. So it wasn't the big cities, but it was one of the regions in Russia which was producing a lot of oil, you know, giving a lot of money back, and then they didn't have the money to build proper toilets, to build a proper building, school building with proper toilets. Essentially, they were essentially making the kind of outside kind of things where the kids had to go outside and then sit in this thing with no heating, nothing, all year round, with essentially a hole dug in the ground, and they sit above this hole in the floor. Right, so there's a lot of stories like this coming out of Russia, and obviously no people not paying attention, but a very interesting fact, we're gonna look it up. How many Russians have international passports? Right. Oh, have a passport. Okay, and now. Okay, basically there is statistics, and it talks about people having international passports. Google doesn't seem to show this one, or it needs some looking after. But over 70% of Russian population simply do not have an international passport, right? So in the country of 130 million or so, right? Yeah, external passports. Okay, by type. Let's take a look. We're gonna allow, fuck it. Right, so external passports given, like, 4.5, close to 5, 2.7, right, 3.9 millions. So these are the millions of passports. Each passport is kind of valid for like 10 years or so. So like if we look at this, right, countries, so but basically the number of passports given, like again, some of them is like people who are reapplying for passports because it's run out, but things like this. But there's a statistic that like only 30% of Russians actually do have an external passport. An external passport is the passport which allows you to travel outside of Russia. So it's like most of the Europeans and US citizens won't get it, but like in Russia and for example Ukraine as well, maybe a couple of other ex-Soviet bloc countries, they have this internal and external passport. Like I think they were thinking about bringing that one in UK again. So after Brexit, so 30% are capable of traveling outside the country. Not all of them do, or not all of them can travel in Europe, for example, or like West, or even Taiwan, Thailand. Some of them travel like to nearby countries, but not as much. Right, by about 50% of the Russian population, if we go back to this one, obviously, these people don't even travel outside their region. About 30% of the population have not even been to the capital of their region, so they would be like travel from their village or little town to like not a regional center but district center town, and that would be the best they can do, right? Because obviously very very low income levels in most of the Russia outside of Moscow and probably St. Petersburg. Right, so there's two main cities. Moscow has the highest level of income. So people go like, oh yeah, but look, there's so many Russians around. I'm like, guys, look, the 30% of 130 million people makes up for 33 million people, 33, 34 million people who are capable of traveling. Right, so that would be probably, I don't know, population of Spain 2020. right? So population of Spain was only like 10 million more than the amount of Russians that can travel. So essentially, imagine that like 3/4 of Spain have just gone up and just started traveling around the world. There would be a lot of Spaniards around, right? So that's what gets the 30 odd million who do have travel permits, right? So I mean, I don't know. Maybe you can look some countries, but essentially, like 30 million of people who can travel. It's a population of some countries. Like probably half the population of UK. Imagine half of the population of United Kingdom have lifted themselves up and started traveling. Right? They are people probably not like UK very much after that. But nevertheless, these are people who can travel and see the world. But even out of those people, it's not all equal because there's lots of Russians living in Germany, for example, and they would not kind of fit in with the local society, and they'd be like, yeah, the Russia's gonna come and get you, right? They're still kind of very militaristic. They only look for information in Russian sources, not just Russian language sources, but we're talking Russian sources alone, right? The poverty means that people don't have a lot of access to information, so they will not have access to internet. Like, many areas the internet providers there do not exist. Like, they might have a mobile phone. Most of the people will not have a mobile phone with the internet, but those who even might have a mobile phone with the internet, because in Russia there's a lot of cheap Chinese knockoff phones. There's a lot of people who can buy a phone because it was stolen and then it was just brought in Russia and sold for a lot cheaper. A lot of people obviously live in groups. So in Germany it's a WG flat, for example, named like this. Shared flats in UK, similar stuff in France, obviously in US, but many people there would leave, so they would pay less bills and then just share, like buy shared food, like whether it's a young family or something like this. They might be able to save up and buy like a mobile phone for an entire family, and then they go like, oh, we can go on the internet. But even if they do, the access they will have, most of them do not speak any other languages rather than Russian, right? And they will only look for Russian sources of information. Like, even if they go on YouTube and they look at Ukraine and they go like, okay, what does the Rus TV says about Ukraine? They will not look for Ukrainian sources. They'll not go like, oh, look, what is the Ukrainian magazine? Is there an Ukrainian magazine who reads the news? Because they literally just don't want to know. Like, it's the echo chamber which has been created because many of them get the news from the TV, and it creates like a very huge echo chamber. Many people simply don't want to know. They travel, they see the world, but they'll be like, yeah, it's like I'm living really well in Russia, so I'm happy there. But 70% of people have never been outside of Russia. They have not seen anything else. Many of them have not been outside their towns. They say even if they do get some information, if they like, if there's something practical, they will react to it. But if it's something which kind of contradicts the opinion of the TV, they'll go like, no, this is a lie. Like they will live in the buildings where they have like no, I don't know, no normal, like toilet is not working, the bath, there's no running water. They essentially have to bring the water from the well into a 5-story building. It happens in Russia, but as soon as the TV says, look, this is the Americans' fault that it's happening to you, they will go, yeah, this is the Americans' fault that it's happening to us. Like, even the fact that that very TV is gonna tell them, look, the President Putin is now one of the top 5 richest people in the world, right? You know, how did he get that? Nobody knows. But it's the Americans that make you poor. How does this happen? Like, they already talking in Russia, and I was saying that again a long time ago, saying that, like, look, the Russians are going to be saying that they're fighting against Europe. They're in Ukraine. The fighting is not going to be against Ukraine. It's going to be against Europe, and it's going to be against NATO and US. Right, and that's what they getting now. Is like Russian channels increasingly peddling this one. Like, but what they don't talk about, for example, is this is a Ukrainian channel, ICTV, but the program is made by Freedom UA, and essentially I switched off the sound, but essentially this is the video that talks about the fires, the forest fires in Russia. Nobody talks about this on the news anymore. Like last few years when these happened, they sometimes kind of seep through into the news. This year, nothing. Right, there were forest fires that essentially annihilate small towns and villages. Left pretty much unchecked because they don't have the equipment to deal with that, and obviously beforehand, when it was the military that had to deal with this kind of stuff. Now, of course, a lot of military is in Ukraine. There's not just fires, there's like floods, and there's floods around there which happened as well, which again left unchecked. Right, people talking about this is fires. Oh, yeah. Okay, this is the fire Krasnoyarsk. It's kind of closer to the center of Russia. People showing the smoke they have in there, and flash floods in other parts of Russia. Essentially, yeah. And this is not hitting pretty much the news outside of local regions, and people don't even look for this. They don't know, don't care. Right. Over the last few years, obviously, like, you know, the poverty line was very low, very, like, you know, it's like, and the only way the Russians kind of see their greatness, many of them, they see by building up this kind of hype that, look, we're a great nation, like, obviously we have to fight against Americans, or we have to do this, and, like, you know, making up enemies they don't really have, and this is their own way, the only way they can deal with the reality. I'm sure, like this, for example, video shows, or the reality that the actual wage is about $200 for many people in there. So it does help that things are a bit cheaper than in Europe, but to be honest, like quite often I say people have to live 2-3 together, and the thing is like, I was watching some Russian channel where people showing, look, we're doing so great. Again, we're talking about the top 30% of the country, so people who do have better earnings, they speak English, and they say they live so well, but they do address that issue of like, look, you know, look, my parents are making, like, you know, they get like $200 a month pension, right? But the way they do it is because they still own the flat which they received during the Soviet Union times. So they got this flat for free at the time pretty much, and now they live in it, and because they live together, they use majority of their money to obviously pay bills, and then the rest of their money they use to kind of buy food and maybe some clothes, because two of them, they cook at home, they don't have much to do ever since. And so that was the position of that before the war started, right? You know, people getting bad information. And look, some of the Russians, they do feel that Ukrainians are being saved by Russian military. They essentially say, we went there to save you, right? You know, we want, like, so they don't feel there is a war. They went there to save us. Again, one thing I wanted to point out is for many Russians, this is still a virtual war. This is why, you know, at the start of it, now the support for the war, when they started to feel, when the coffins started coming back home, when their sons started to go missing, there is a lower support for the war. But at the start of it, it was a virtual war. Why do we talk about virtual war? Essentially, they did not feel the damage. Like, you know, for example, when they were bombing the living shit out of Syria, right? When they were bombing the living shit out of Georgia, like, or when they were like completely annihilating Chechen people by just leveling Grozny to the ground, or the invasion to Ukraine in 2014, all of this were happening and they did not have such a great losses. Like, you know, they did not have lose as many people, so these wars were essentially virtual. Like in Syria, they lost what, like 200, 300 people. No, I think there was, yeah, about 300 to 400 people, like, you know, because the people they were fighting, they did not have the equipment to fight back, right? They did not have anti-airplane defenses, which Ukrainian had. They didn't really have lots of tanks, like, you know, they didn't have good artillery to fight back to them. Like in 2014, again, they've captured two very major cities in Ukraine and Crimea, and essentially Ukrainians were like, we don't want to have a full-out war because these are huge cities, they're full of Ukrainians, and these Ukrainians are gonna become victims of that. Obviously, over the 10 years, the feelings maybe changed a little bit because the people on the other side, like under the Russian control, have become part of those echo chambers where they would only watch Russian news. They wouldn't really have good access to internet, and even the internet they had, again, it was very much controlled. Just to give you an example as well, at the 2014, there was a case, probably not gonna find it at the moment, but at the start of Russian invasion into Ukraine in 2014, there was a case where the Russians have claimed that it was the Ukrainian airplane shot up a square with some people in the square, and it shot up and killed some people, right? And they were doing this, saying this is like, look, you know, here's a video of the plane flying, you know, it's like, well, this was the plane that killed all those people. And I actually went in there, somebody was like saying this on the one of the Russian websites, and what I did, I was like, look, those are 30 millimeter shells, and we're gonna go here. Yep, I found essentially this one. This is part of the Russian, and I think still there are some in Ukrainian army and many other armies as well. This is an automatic grenade launcher, 30 millimeters, and that would be like, there's a video of it shooting, and essentially the speed at which it shoots is exactly matched the speed of the explosions in the video that they were showing from that square. And I was like, look, that's the video, yes. Automatic grenade launcher. Let's take a look at this. Okay. Skip ads. 183. Right, the speed at which it shoots, right, it's a lot slower than a airplane gun would shoot, essentially. So, and the grenade, the explosions on that square were like within about that kind of tempo. Right, and when I done that, the Russian media because it was a Russian control site, they essentially deleted anything I said about this. Right, they were like, nope, we can't have this, no, people can't read this because of this makes us look really bad. So that was the time when I stopped posting at that media, because anything that would come in and would be factual and would prove Russians wrong, it was just deleted, right? And people living in this kind of echo chamber for a very long time, right? Some of the Russians, and look, a very good friend of mine, I consider her my little sister, but she was staying in Kherson and she managed to get away. And one of the ways she got away, so we're going to talk about more modern time now. So we're not talking 6 months ago. She has done it. She just came here like about a week ago to Germany. And she was talking to me about traveling, because the way they done it is they go out of Kherson. Let me just put up the map. Right, they go out from Kherson just before they finished off the bridge. And then they drove, I think, across Crimea, then across here, and then all the way across all of Russia here, so around Ukraine, all the way up to Moscow, and from Moscow they ended up going to, okay, so up this motorway to Moscow, and from Moscow they ended up going through Latvia, Lithuania, and then Poland, and then into Germany. Right, so it was a very long trip. There's some interesting stories to tell about their travel. She hasn't told me everything, because they ended up getting some help to settle in Stuttgart. I'm in Berlin. We have only spoken on the phone, and at the moment she only has a Ukrainian phone. So obviously if she speaks too much on it, it's gonna be like a very big bill for her to pay. And she was saying like, look, I've traveled across Russia, I've talked to people, and to be honest, people do not believe me that I did not want to be saved. People who help them, she says, look, they're very good people, but they honestly believe they are saving me in Kherson by bombing the living shit out of me. They're saving me from American spies. And they said, look, we're saving you from the Nazis. And she goes like, what Nazis? What are you talking about? You know, I lived there. The only Nazi I've seen was on a screen in a historic movie. And she was like, look, it's from and it's the NATO spies that make her believe that. Is like, you know, the only guy she kind of known about NATO, who had any relationship to NATO, was this Yuri guy, which is me, who's the closest he actually lived to US was when he lived in England. And I didn't really tell you much about that part of my life, but at some point of time I did work in a NATO base near Stuttgart. That's the closest relationship to NATO and US she ever had. Right, she's like, look, never heard of any spies, but the people were adamant, even though they have never been to Ukraine, they have never been outside their town, but they help them because they're kind of religious and they want to help people, they want to do good, but they're adamant that call her my little sister, needed saving from Ukrainian Nazis who were definitely going to come and kill her. They've been trying to save Ukraine from Nazis since, I don't know, since beginning of 2000s, and so far the only people who got killed are Ukrainians by Russian soldiers. But those people still do not believe that. They openly say, "Whoa, we're saving you," right? You know, it's like we're supporting the saving of Ukrainian people, and right. But now the support of the war is fallen a bit because obviously there's a lot of casualties. You know, there's only the Russian military even has to confirm tens of thousands of dead, a lot more missing in action. Stories coming out of Ukraine. Let me take a look. Uh, 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 yes, some. There is some news. I'm not saying this is 100% true, but basically these are the news which says that the one of the Ukrainian tractor drivers was, I mean, basically they made him to dig up the trench, and they brought in the soldiers which were killed in action, and some of them were not actually even still dead, and the tractor driver was like, "Oh guys, those are not really dead soldiers, right?" You know, and he was like, he's like, "No, just cover them with the ground, that's it." You know, we don't have the means and ways to 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 help them, and you know, we just don't have the means and ways of getting them back home, or we don't want to. So there's a lot of people like this who died. Their sons gone missing. Has been a big story about a Russian father whose son was a conscript into the Russian fleet. He was on the Moscow ship, the one which was down by Ukrainians by Ukrainian missile, actually Ukrainian missile Neptune. And the ship went down. Everybody, the crew went down with it. Pretty much no one survived. And this father was like, "Look, my son was serving on this ship. What's going on? Can you let me know if he was one of the people who survived?" And he finally managed to get them to admit that his son is dead, that he was on the ship, and that he's dead. And it took him months, and they just paid him up, but obviously more and more people are not coming back home. And Russians at the moment are having trouble recruiting more soldiers to go and fight for the army, right? So that comes back to haunt Russia. So less and less support happening there, because people are like, "Hey, you know, I have like my little town has like 300 new graves." You know, it's like out of like 350 guys who went to serve, 8 months ago, there's a 300 new graves. So something's going really, really wrong. So there's very big losses. They've been replaced by people, well, not very good character. Again, like my poor people. The Russian poverty came across to Ukraine, and again, uh, um, this is what I'm looking up, is the pictures. Let's go images. Right, there's basically images. Yeah, this one, for example, the Russian military soldiers, They brought in the stuff they stole in Ukraine, and they essentially were mailing it back to Russia, and it was happening in Belarus, and the basically the Belarus people have shared where the stolen goods were going. Right, is another picture of people like carrying the stolen goods on their tanks. Right, this picture is actually has a bit of a funny story behind it, because when it hit the internet, yeah, this is the newspaper, right? One of the Ukrainian refugees have actually, I'm not gonna make it active, but one of the Ukrainian refugees is actually recognized the things she owned on the picture of the tank, like carrying the stolen goods. So essentially she was like, wait a minute, that's my shit. You know, why are you taking it? Bring it back. Right, stories from the, like, and this is beginning of the war. This is not even now, right? You know, this is like when the Russians just came in. Like, there's some of the people in some of the towns that were freed from Russians. There's a story by a Ukrainian soldier who was like, oh, this is my town, you know, like, and they freed the town so they get some free time, you know. It's like, he says, look, I'm gonna pop into my house, just get some new clothes and stuff like this, extra to take with me. And his commanding officer said, okay, cool, no problem. So the guy makes it to his home, and essentially his flat was completely robbed. And he said, look, you know, they took the stuff, but also the stuff they took is like my worn underwear and my old socks. So the underwear drawers and socks drawers, like most of the clothes were nicked. He was like, look, why would you take, like, I understand if I had like a pack of new underwear and you took that, I would get it. But it's like, you know, the old underwear which is already stretched in all the right places, you know, and they nicked even that. I'm like, that's the stories. Like I said, this is what we're talking about, the poverty in Russia at that time, and many people in the military, they're representatives of that poverty, right? And what is happening now is like they're starting to. First they were like, look, you know, here I'm sending like a washing machine to my wife or stuff like this. Whereas now what happens is the sanctions are starting to kick in, right? And as well, right, many people were like saying, oh, the sanctions are not working against the Russians and they're not gonna feel them and the state is blah blah blah. Well, the sanctions are starting to kick in, and this is one of the reasons that, because obviously when the companies are leaving Russia, they're saying, look, we're leaving, we're getting out of here because your troops are not where they're supposed to be, you know. And this time around, we're not just gonna look past that because you done shit you shouldn't have done. You know, it's like if, for example, in Syria you came up with, you know, there was a nutcase in charge of the country, but he at least half legal and he invited you in there, right? In Georgia you managed to come up with some bullshit. You know, in Ukraine beforehand, you know, you did not do any serious damage, you know. It kind of ended up half peaceful, so we really were hoping you're gonna get the fucking message when we told you stop. Don't do that shit, right? But the Russian government did not stop, they continued doing the shit, and the companies are leaving Russia and things like this, but the way they do it in a civilized manner, right? So if we seeing like about end of April, May, the exodus of companies has begun, and about end of May, beginning of June, like most of the companies have left Russia. Right, but the way they've done it is kind of done it in a civilized way. So they said, look, we're leaving the country, but obviously the people who are left unemployed, you know, who we're firing, we're gonna continue paying you wages for for the next 3 months, right? So these kind of create that kind of thing where these people, and there's a lot of the people who are heavily dependent on the income that comes from these companies. Because, like, for example, there's a factory of building cars somewhere in Samara, right? It employs, let's say, 2,000 people, but the money that goes into the economy of Samara actually supports like 200,000 people, because it allows the shops to work, it allows the shops to buy things from the farms, the cafes, the different coffee houses, their little restaurants, and it kind of like creates this kind of effect where people like, now for the last 3 months, the people that worked in that factory in Samara, they've just been fired, yes, and because they have been fired, now these 3 months are run out, they're gonna stop getting the money. So this is what one of the things which heavily influence the fact that now only about 40% support the invasion in Ukraine versus the about 40% against, and about 20% who are like, we're not sure about that. Obviously we're gonna see more of these things, but as well what we see is, there's an article I've got here, right? Yeah. By Denis Kazansky. Yeah, okay, this is the, obviously, yeah. This is an article which shows the Russian army by Ukrainian guy, who basically shows that the Russian army, to show that Ukrainians were shelling Donetsk, they shot it up, but what they did is they shot at the city from the east, and essentially the way they blew up the buildings, there was no way for Ukrainians to be able to do that. So it could only have come from Russian side. And people, again, they filmed it, they made it available on the internet just to prove that, yeah, it's Russian shelling to fight the Russian propaganda, but it's very, very hard. But this is another article by a Ukrainian, Ivan Kirichevsky. This is a very interesting article. It is in Russian, but it talks about the fact that Russians had to admit that they basically cannot produce the necessary equipment for the war. Like, they can't produce high enough quality chips to send the missiles. For example, for the artillery and all the shells, they can't produce the right equipment. So, for example, they have a whole bunch of old Soviet artillery pieces, and essentially they are cannibalizing them to continue shooting, because some of them might not be in a good technical state to do the shooting, but what they will have, it will have the barrel which can be still used. So they will use the barrel and just put it on the something which can actually be shot. But a lot of that equipment, old Soviet equipment, is really not in a good condition. They do have a lot and lots of artillery shells, but again, they already shot up a lot of those. So about 7 million shells they already shot up in Ukraine, and they only had like 15 million left from the ex-Soviet Union. They produce some, but it's not a lot of that, and they cannot really restock them. The same goes about the missiles and aviation. Again, a lot of that was heavily dependent on getting chips from abroad, and now even Chinese are going like, well, sorry guys, but look, we're in deep shit economically ourselves. If we're gonna start selling you stuff and the world is gonna have an excuse to close us down, they will close us down, and that's gonna be the end of Chinese dream, right? So they don't have the chips, they don't have the equipment to fix their missiles, to produce a lot more missiles. There is a chip production in Russia, but it's very, very, very small. Like, it doesn't produce enough. And to be honest, to return to the opportunities they had before, it's like that's not happening. Like, and they don't have the equipment to do this. And again, things like tanks and carriers and macroeconomics. I talked about this, for example, to some in Ukrainian. One of the Ukrainian videos is that again they don't have now the people who can work on the tanks, and they cannot build a lot of new tanks. They can have like 5-6 a year, and they can't even refurbish the old tanks because again they don't have the equipment. It goes a bit more in depth, but essentially they don't have equipment, they don't have the skills to continue producing the military equipment. So over the next, well, it's still a long while, it's still few months, right? They're gonna start running out, right? It's still gonna continue for a while because they do still have like old stockpiles, and I've shared before that there was pictures of them sending tanks T-62s from 1962 where they brought them up, they fixed them up a bit, it's like, and these tanks, yes, they're old, they're shed, but there's still there's hundreds of them and thousands of them, and they still have 150 mil, 120 mil cannons or something like this, so they can still do the damage. It's like they're horrible, but if they were fighting against American army, that would be one story. But Ukrainian army is still not that much more advanced than the Russian army, so they can still kill people, right? And the problem they had, they did not have an opportunity to replenish their ranks lately, and this is where the sanctions come in. This is what I was saying, is that the companies firing people and people ending up without money, and they say, hey, it came to us, it stopped being a virtual war. We have people on the graveyards, but we're also losing our wages, and as we lose our wages means we become incapable of supporting our families, doing stuff like this. And obviously this is because of the war, because obviously the owners of the companies were like, well, you shouldn't have done that. But it also creates this weird situation where all the Ukrainians go like, it's good. There's very weird situations where in the next couple of months, as things become more expensive in Russia, and they do, again, what's his name? There's a Russian commentators, Stepan Dimura, one of them. I mentioned him in my previous videos. Potapenko. Let me look him up. Yeah, Dmitry Potapenko. Right. This guy, he runs a network of stores and a couple of other businesses around Russia. He said he had to cut down on some of the businesses. He had to shrink the businesses because the people, they're losing the ability to buy stuff. He does talk in his videos about the growth of prices in Russia. This is now, so this is why less and less Russians say they support the war. But also there comes that many of them are starting to get angry because apparently they're suffering for no good reason. So there is going to be that part where I did talk about this in some previous videos, where they were like, the government is running this way. This is like, look, this is the West's fault. We're fighting the West, like they're all against us. We have to come around the government. Obviously, there will be a call to the arms as well soon. As at the moment, it's not very good because people still have money. They still have at least some hope. But in the next couple of months, many of those people are gonna be running out of money. And look, now what they happens is many what do you call it, like many like private military companies, for example, already saying, hey, come fight with us in Ukraine and we're gonna pay you 250,000 rubles. Now that is something many people would make in a couple of years, and that 250,000 rubles, this is a sign-on bonus, and then you get the same for every month you survive in Ukraine. Right? These people, they don't get very well trained. They just kind of get shoved in there as a cannon fodder. But to be honest, most of the time these companies do this because they don't expect to pay for a long time. As a similar kind of offer from Russian military that is appearing all over Russia, and essentially it's going to be aimed to get the more active people, the ones who want to take care about their families, and to get them into the military and to get them into fighting. Some of those people are ex-military, so they do need less training. They're probably going to be put into the kind of more specialized forces, which are going to be given better equipment, or at least that's what they will hope for. But overall, the overview inside Russia is at the moment there's a bit of an anger growing in the ground population, that they're suffering. And again, because they're in the echo chamber, people gonna be pointing it towards the NATO that is killing Russians in Ukraine, and the NATO wants Russia to fall, and that was gonna be the message all along. And I've talked about this with my Russian friends. I've made a video saying this, that look, the target is to say that, look, to get as many Russians killed as possible, right? But get the anger inside the country growing, so that to make them unite around the government, so that the government doesn't get kicked out because they have led Russia into deep shit. And we can see this from this article. Essentially, the oil money they were all the money they were getting as income from oil and stuff like this, which they were, instead of investing them into the country, creating skills, creating jobs, they were essentially kind of running the country at as much, just enough as possible, so that the people don't revolt, but we're gonna be like, having billions and billions in our pockets. And this is why President Putin is one of the top 5 richest people in the world. So I've been going for quite a while, so I think I'm almost done. But obviously next things is gonna be like in the next few months, as people get poorer and probably a bit angrier, there will be a big push to get people into the military and send them over to Ukraine. Why? Well, the reason for that would be is very simple. They want to get rid of proactive people, essentially. Like the Russian military, that soldiers that have any sense of surroundings, they're all being thrown to the front lines. Why is it being done? Well, again, very many people, when they look at the history of Russia, they think that they say, oh, it's the revolution that got rid of the last Tsar of Russia. In reality, it was not. In reality, it was the military revolt that got rid of the last Tsar of Russia. And it's true, essentially the generals that saw how badly Russia was doing and understood that the Russia needed the new leadership, they stopped the Tsar's train and they forced him. They essentially gave him a span and said, "Look, here's the order where you abdicate your throne to your brother or cousin. I don't remember, like one of them, to your cousin, I think, and or brother or cousin. Don't look it up. And you abdicate on behalf of yourself and your son, and your family gets kicked out. That's it. You're not ruling the country anymore. You're a fucking disaster. We need to get rid of you." And he's like, "If you don't, then your family we're gonna just simply shoot you motherfuckers, and that's it. That will be done." Right, that's what happened before, and I think that the government of Russia, including the top military government, are afraid of the repetition of that situation, considering that just few years back, well, like nearly 30 years back now, similar situation happened during the fall of Soviet Union, where the generals got together and they had this putsch where they tried to save the Soviet Union by overthrowing the government of Russia, which was one of the first republics, if not the first republic, to get out of the Soviet Union. And those generals tried to have a military takeover of the power, and they failed. Right, so in the times of the Tsar they succeeded, in the times of Soviet Union they failed. They did not have the support of the military and the people. Right, well, the Russian government did not want the repeat of the same situation, and for that they only wanted people to remain who were actually in cahoots with the current leadership of the country. But also what happened was that, to be honest, if you look at the military country, I talked about this, that the Russian invasion and crossing the Dnieper River here, actually the fact that they have succeeded in this area has basically put them on the losing ground. So if that attack here was actually knocked back, so if they did not have so much success here, they could have gone back to this kind of position that, look, we're fighting against NATO, not against Ukrainians, and this is why we failed here and we've lost so many soldiers. But that was like because the NATO done it. Like, the fact that Ukrainians have managed to hold back the Russians and even push them back without any major Western support. The Ukrainians have only started getting the support recently, was not giving them the possibility of saying that, yes, we are fighting against all of Europe, we're fighting against all of NATO. Right now that Ukraine started getting the support from the West, from Germany, from mostly NATO countries, obviously some of them are not, but most of them are. Now that we see that Finland and Sweden and Norway kind of going like, hey guys, maybe was a good idea to join NATO, and they did join NATO. Now the Russians are saying like, yeah, we're fighting the NATO in Ukraine. Right, so essentially they're going back to that, like, we're fighting the West, and the reason we might be losing and the reason we will lose is the fact that, it's not Ukrainians that are fighting us, it's the American spies and, like, American soldiers that are fighting. They pretend to be Russians, so, like, the Ukrainian soldiers that are trained in UK now, like, I think it's like 10,000 soldiers a month have training in Ukraine. Now they're going to be saying this is not the 10,000 soldiers that will come from UK, the Ukrainians who will come back from Ukraine. The Russians will say, no, those are not Ukrainian soldiers, those are just NATO soldiers wearing Ukrainian uniform. Just wait and see. That was what was going to happen. Right, essentially now there's like trying to do that. So this is why we're going to probably see that not so much the support for the war, but at least the pro-war kind of mood in Russia is probably going to go on the upswing. In the next couple of months, they're probably going to be able to replenish their troops. Maybe not as good equipment, but nevertheless, the numbers are probably going to go up even, because as the sanctions kick in, as more people losing their jobs, as things become more expensive for Russia because they heavily dependent on the imported goods, and not just from China but also from all over Europe, and more people refusing to trade with Russia. Things are, we're gonna see that some more and more people gonna take on that, gonna take that piece of paper which says, hey, come in, enroll with us, go fight in Ukraine, we're gonna pay you money. You're gonna have more and more people going and joining that military force. So we're probably gonna see the intensification of new troops going into Ukraine, unless Ukrainians can obviously manage to finish this war. And again, the faster Ukrainians finish this war, the less Ukrainians suffer, but also the less Russians die. And it will come with some new troubles, I'm sure, but essentially, like, at this point of time, like, the faster this ends, the faster, like, things, the more Ukraine gets help, the faster this gets done, and then the less chances for the Russians to come in. Obviously, the Russians building up their troops around Ukraine, it's not going to be liked by many, but they will not be able to keep this up for long. But the fighting, as long as the fighting goes on, right, there's going to be more and more Russians coming in the next few months, not even out of support for the war, but because simply they will need the money to feed their families. And I think on this one, like, I'm going to finish. I've talked for quite a while, and I'm sorry if I bored you to half death. I wish I could just bore the Russians to death so that no other Ukrainians could die, but that's not gonna happen. But I've tried to cover the subject as much as I could. Again, please also do look for the other channels I talk about at the start of this video. And if there's any questions or you want comments, please do write them. I'll try to answer them as much as I can. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye.